Hello everyone. Under the international trade theories, we are done with the theories of mercantilism and absolute cost advantage theory and the comparative cost advantage theory. So these three theories comes under the classical viewpoint, and where the theory of the Hexa and Oilin is comes under the modern theory. So Hexa and Oilin theory also called as the factor endowment theory or the factor abundance theory. So other three theories, new trade theory based on the economies of scale, the product life cycle theory and Porter's competitive advantage theory are not comes under modern theory or the classical viewpoint, because these all are the recent theories. Okay, the economies of scale, product life cycle and the Porter's competitive advantage. Here the viewpoint is little bit different. So let's go for the Hexa and Wohling theory. Hexa is the teacher of the violin. The Hexa is introduced this particular theory and it is developed by Bertil Violin. Cause of the trade is international differences in the labor productivity. Okay, so that is said by the Ricardian view, but differences in the country's resources is a matter here, and that is the cause of the trade as per the Hexa and Violin. Okay, it is also called as Violin's view. Okay, so developed by Elie Hexa and the Bertin Violin, and also called as factor proportion theory, factor endowment theory, because it discussed the proportions in which different factors of productions are available in different countries and the proportion in which they are used in producing a different type of the goods. So assumptions are that two factors of productions, capital and labor, two countries, India and Japan, or we can say it as country A and country B, differ in a factor abundance or the endowments. Okay, here the availability of the factors of production, capital or labor, are different in both the countries. Two commodities, steel and cloth. This particular theory is called as the 2 by 2 by 2 model. Okay, two factors of production, two countries and the two commodities. Steel is a more capital intensive and cloth is more labor intensive in both the countries. The both goods uses both factors and the relative factor intensities are the same for each good in two countries. Okay. So based on these proportions, the Hexa-Oilin model predicts that the capital surplus country specializes in the production and export of the capital intensive goods, and the labor surplus country specializes in the production and export of labor intensive goods. Okay, so those countries which is having more capital and less labor, they should produce the capital intensive goods and they should export it for other country, and those countries which is having more labor and less capital, they should produce the labor intensive goods and they should export it to the other countries. So what it says, some commodities can be brought cheaply from other region when compared to the present region. Thus, the main cause of the trade between the region is difference in the price of the commodities based on relative factor endowments or abundance. Okay. So, the factor endowments or the abundance or is availability of the factors relatively, that is a cause of the trade. So there is two viewpoints or two type of the explanations. Factor abundance in terms of the factor price. So for example, in Japan, if the capital is relatively cheaper, then it produce the capital oriented goods and export it to the India. And if in India the labor is relatively cheaper than a capital, then it produce the labor oriented goods and export it to the Japan. So suppose the capital is more abundant and labor is less abundant, and if the Japan is produced labor oriented goods, then what happens? That becomes costlier than other countries. So in which country the factor endowments or the factors of productions are relatively cheaper, so they should specialize in that particular type of the product and they should export it to the other country. Okay, so that is in terms of the price. So next one is the factor abundance in physical terms. The Japan, if it is relatively capital intensive or if the capital is available more, then it produces the capital oriented goods and export it to India. If the India is relatively labor intensive, then it should produce the labor oriented goods and it export it to the Japan. Okay. So what is the difference between point 1 and 2 here? Point 1 speaks about the price and point 2 speaks about the availability in terms of the physical number. Okay. So what is gain from the trade? The trade leads to convergence of the relative prices, in which in turn has a strong effect on the relative earnings of the factors of the production. Okay. So here the consideration is two countries, country A, or we can say it as Japan, country B, it is India. So capital abundant and high CL ratio, capital labor ratio it is, and low relative cost of the capital, and produces the capital intensive goods, that is steel, and low relative price of the steel. Okay. So the price of the steel and the price of the cloth. The export in the steel and imports the cloth, whereas India is a labor abundant, there is a low capital labor ratio. Okay. So here the capital is less and the labor is high. High relative cost of the capital. Relatively, the cost of the capital is high and produces a labor intensive products, that is a cloth, and high relative price of the steel. Okay. So relationship between the price of the steel and the price of the cloth is a high, and the India should export the cloth and import the steel. So this is the summary of the Hexa and Wheeling theory. It provides a different explanations of the comparative advantage. Comparative advantage arises from the differences in the national factor endowments or the availability of the national factors. Difference in the endowments explains the differences in the factors cost. The more abundant a factor, the lower its cost. As you know, if our resources is available more, then the cost of that will be lesser. This theory assumes that technologies are the same across the countries. Okay. The main assumption is this: the technologies are the same in both the countries. So usually the Hexa and Wheeling theory is a superior theory. Okay. So why it is called as a superior theory than the absolute cost advantage and the comparative cost advantage? HO theory has more common sense appeal. The US has long been as a substantial exporter of the agricultural goods, reflecting in part its unusual abundance of arable land. Okay. China exports labor intensive manufactured goods, reflecting China's relative abundance of low cost of the labor. The US, which lacks abundance labor, imports those goods from the China. It is relative, not the absolute endowments that are important. Remember, the relative endowments or the abundance of the factors of production are the important. So now, while we speak about the limitations of the Hexa and Wheeling theory, other limitations you can explain it very easily, where the assumptions itself becomes the limitations of the particular theory, and here the very important research made. Okay, so that is called as Leontief paradox. So Hexa and Wheeling theory, one of the most influential theoretical ideas of the international economics, makes few simplifying assumptions than the Ricardian theory. Okay. The Hexa and Wheeling theory has been a subject to many empirical tests and most raised questions about its validity. So most of the criticisms says it is not valid. The most famous of these criticisms is from the Vasily Leontief in the year 1953 for the US. So let's see what is Leontief's paradox. Since the US was relatively abundant in the capital compared to other nations, the US would be an exporter of the capital intensive goods and importer of the labor intensive goods. This is as per the Hexa and Wheeling theory. However, Leontief found that US exporters were less capital intensive than the US imports. US will export more labor oriented goods. So this is what the observations of the Leontief. So this is known as Leontief's paradox. Paradox means opposite argument. Okay. Why it is so? Let's see for what reason this is happened. This is because of the simple assumptions of Hexa and Wheeling. So that is the technology is same in both the countries. So that is what the assumptions. So in case there is a changes in the technology, that affects the export of one particular country. US has a special advantage in producing a new and innovative products. Such products may be less capital intensive and heavily used like a labor and innovative entrepreneurship. So example, the computer software where the technology and a skilled labors are needed than the capital. Okay. Maybe due to the assumptions of the uniform technology across the countries, this paradox is observed. The Leontief paradox, difference in the technology may lead to the difference in the productivity, which in turn drives the international trade patterns. Okay, so instead of the comparative cost advantage or relative abundance of the factors of productions, the technology, if it differs between the countries, that is a matter and that drives the international trade patterns as per the Leontief. New research shows that once the differences in the technology across the countries are controlled, for the countries do indeed export goods that make intensive use of the factors that are locally abundant. Okay. So, in case if one country is good at technology, then they are going to export those type of the products even though the labor is relatively less abundant. Okay, because the number of the labor is not a matter here, the technology and skill of the labor is matters. That is, the Hexa and Wohlin has the predictive power once the impact of the difference of the technology on the productivity is controlled for. So, if the technology is impacting on the productivity, then the Hexa and Wohlin theory is not applicable. Okay. So, for this particular theory, you can refer the International Business by Charles W. Hill and Arun K. Jain. Okay. So, that is of Tata McGraw-Hill's publications. Another one is International Business by Oded Shankar and Yodom Leo Willi publications. So, these two books are available in our library. You can read this one.